Imagine you wake up one day and you can only start your car right at the top of the hour, on the hour. And actually, now your car isn't even stored at your house at all. It's a mile away. Just imagine how limiting and how unfree that would make you feel. In Chicago, if you don't own a car, either by choice or because you can't drive or can't afford one, this is essentially what may happen to a lot of people very soon. The state of Illinois failed to step in at the literal 11th hour to save public transit from a massive budget shortfall. This is going to lead to equally massive cuts in transit service. We're talking whole L lines possibly shutting down, bus routes vanishing from the map, and the hours of the remaining buses and trains being cut sharply. This isn't just a problem for people who depend on the bus and the train. It means less economic strength for the whole region and more frustration for everyone, including drivers. The fight isn't over yet, and please stick around to the end to find out how I'm partnering with Better Streets Chicago to provide a lot of concrete steps you can take to get involved. In this very special video, we'll talk about the Chicago Transit fiscal cliff and how we can hopefully make sure this doesn't actually happen. Before we get going, I just want to say thank you for watching this. Thanks for caring about this issue, and please tell your family, friends, coworkers, tell everyone about this and tell them they need to get involved. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss future updates about this. How we got here starts with a little thing called the fare box recovery ratio. In Illinois, 50% of operating funds for public transit has to come from the fares people pay to ride the buses and trains. The problems with that model really showed itself in 2020 and the years after the pandemic. People stopped traveling for a hot minute, and many people still haven't returned to the office in the same way they did before the pandemic. In Chicago, our transit systems are especially set up for people traveling downtown to work, and that just wasn't and isn't happening as much as it used to. To date, the CTA only has around 68% of the ridership it did before the pandemic. With ridership numbers that low and the requirement that 50% of funding has to come from passenger fares, there's just no way that CTA, Metra, and PACE can fund themselves. The fare box recovery ratio was temporarily suspended because of all this, and the region's transit agencies got $3.5 billion in federal funds to help keep themselves afloat. The CTA alone got almost $1 billion from the American Rescue Plan, but as early as 2022, they already knew we'd run out of money eventually. And a lot of these problems go beyond the fare box recovery problem. The state of Illinois provides far less funding for its biggest region's public transit than other comparable states do. Pennsylvania and Massachusetts each contribute more than twice as much to their biggest cities' transit than Illinois does. These cities also have a remarkably more consolidated, integrated transit network than Chicago does. The current model in Chicago sort of pins Metra against the CTA as a competitor for riders, and it also pins the city against the suburbs. With leaders in the region calling for more transit funding, the state said, well, you guys gotta change the way you do business too, because this model isn't working. But that's a 2025 problem. No need to worry about it yet. So yeah, it's June 2025 now. The deadline to figure this out was May 31st, and the first time they brought a bill to be voted on the floor was 8 minutes before the deadline. Talk about procrastination. Well, to be fair, before the literal last week before the deadline, 2 transit reform and funding bills were on the table. HB 5823, the Metropolitan Mobility Authority Act, and SB 1938, the United We Move Illinois proposal. But then, on Tuesday, May 27th, 4 days before the deadline, a bill that was originally supposed to be for authorizing bikes to treat stop signs like yield signs suddenly became a new 804-page bill to reform the governance structure of the transit agencies, creating the Northern Illinois Transit Authority, or NITA, and replacing the current Regional Transportation Authority. It would have done a lot of things, but basically it would strengthen the current RTA to have more oversight and centralized authority to plan service, while the current service boards, i.e. CTA, Metra, and PACE, would remain separate to focus on just running trains and buses. The next day, HB 3438, originally an unrelated transportation bill, was amended to include most of the same stuff as the bill from the day before, but with new funding sources coming from a tax on ride shares and a statewide fee of $1.50 on retail deliveries. These reforms and new funding streams would have put NITA in a really good place, addressing the fiscal cliff and having money to spare. A few amendments took place in the next few days, mostly to do with the ins and outs of the assignments to the new board. And finally, HB 3438 was brought to a vote and passed the Senate at 11:48 p.m. on May 31st, the day of the deadline. But it still needed to pass the House, but since it was technically June now, it needed a 3/5 supermajority to pass. They knew they probably did not have those kind of numbers in favor of the bill in the House, so when they wrapped up at 1:30, they just didn't vote on the bill. The Illinois General Assembly honestly deserves some praise for crafting a really good bill, and specifically certain people like Senator Ram Villavalam really put a lot on the line and really fought for transit when it mattered. All that is commendable, but what is not commendable is waiting till the last minute. And there were debates and amendments to the bill right up until the end, but it's possible that just a few more hours would have allowed this bill to cross the finish line. If the bill could have gotten to the House just a few minutes before midnight, it wouldn't have had to get that supermajority, and it would have had a much better fighting chance to get the votes it needed. But then again, apparently the House hadn't even had time to review the funding sources for the bill, so that's also probably why they didn't vote on it. May 31st was the deadline for legislators to get the funding and reform deal done the easy way. But CTA, Metra, and PACE have to start planning based on what they're getting or not getting from Springfield. They have to assume that they won't get that budget gap filled, and the clock is ticking for them to start planning their budget proposals. That's a lot of work, and it needs to be done by October or November at the latest so those budgets can be approved. They're required to have a balanced budget, so really the only way to fill that $770 million gap is to lay off transit workers and run less trains and buses. Costs like HR, IT, and fleet maintenance are a lot less scalable. These are the fixed things you need regardless of whether you're running a lot of service or a little bit of service. They have to start preparing estimates of exactly how many workers to lay off and how that will impact the amount of service they can run. This has other impacts for Metra too, since most of their lines run on shared use railroads with freight rail companies. They have to negotiate their schedules with the railroads, and that takes time and is hard to undo once it's set in motion. That's why the May 31st deadline was so important. Right now, as we speak, CTA, Metra, and PACE are crunching the numbers to determine how many people they now legally have to lay off, what train stations they have to close, what lines they have to shut down, and what buses to cut. Service cuts won't go into effect until January 1st of next year, so until then the agencies will still try to run as much service as they can, but behind the scenes they're in doomsday prep mode, so I wouldn't be surprised if service seems a tad disrupted. We'll come back to the cuts later, but first let's talk about what we can do to get out of this mess. The easy path to getting this funding was getting a deal done before May 31st. Since that ship has sailed, it's harder but not impossible. The General Assembly meets for 2 weeks in the fall to rehash bills like this one that either got vetoed by the governor or didn't pass. By then, it'll still be possible for the agencies to reverse course and adjust for 2026, but the longer we wait, the harder it gets to reverse course. The magnitude of the cuts is so deep this time, even deeper than in 2008 when the CTA was able to avoid cuts with super last-minute assistance from the state. Certain parts of these cuts will be a lot harder to reverse at the last minute, especially with regard to Metra service. They could also kick the can to the 2026 Illinois General Assembly spring session, but by that point the agencies would have the monumental task of rehiring and renegotiating their way out of the hole they're in, which will take more than a year to fix, and a lot of people will be a lot more skeptical of building their lives around public transportation if they have the choice to do so. The Hail Mary at this point would be a special session which can be called by the governor or by a joint proclamation from both the House and Senate presidents. This kind of session limits the discussion to just one topic, so some sort of deal could likely be reached, even if it's not quite the original proposal. And an important thing to remember here is that any special session bill still needs that 3/5 majority to pass in both chambers, which might mean the bills have to cater more to downstate lawmakers who are less keen on raising taxes for transit. When asked about transit in a press conference the morning after the bill didn't pass on June 1st, the governor said he thinks the committee should meet over the summer and work expeditiously for a solution, but he didn't give any indication that a special session would be called. But honestly, that's kind of the only hope of avoiding these cuts at this point in the game. The cost of doing nothing is very high right now. There will be cuts. This isn't the RTA sounding the alarm as some sort of scare tactic. We don't know exactly what they'd look like, but the back of the napkin calculation from the RTA says that we can expect 3,000 transit workers to be laid off. The CTA would have to close or drastically reduce service to 50 rail stations. PACE would cut weekend service. 60% of CTA bus routes could be cut, and Metra would get rid of late night and early morning trains and run less rush hour service. If the CTA closed 50 stations, this is what the map of the L could look like. Credit goes to Starline Chicago for this analysis. But we also really don't know what the cuts will look like. They might just close 50 stations and run less trains to the ones that do stay open, or they might just focus on trying to keep up some semblance of good train frequencies on the busiest lines. We'll find all this out in the next few months. But what we do know with certainty is that these cuts are not a viable path forward for Chicagoland. Traffic will certainly get worse. More people will be involved in crashes, and Chicago will lose a key competitive advantage it has over cities like Dallas or Houston. Our transit is the reason why our downtown is able to be the second biggest concentration of jobs outside of Manhattan. Transit contributes billions to the regional economy in jobs, economic activity, and household savings. It makes Chicago a more attractive place for companies, families, and immigrants alike. If we lose that, people and companies might as well move to Texas or someplace like that. And if these cuts happen, those fare box recovery rate issues we talked about earlier will only get worse. Less riders means less money to fund operations, which leads to more cuts, which leads to less riders, and it's a cycle that goes on until our transit system is basically a social service, something that's just the absolute bare minimum, something that's burdensome for people who do rely on it, and something nobody with any other choice would choose. What the RTA is asking for is not a bailout of a failing system. Just look at the fact that Metra now has more weekend riders than it did before the pandemic. This is about saving the lifeblood of our state's biggest economic engine. And believe me, I grew up in Northwest Illinois, and there's going to be a lot of people in places like that who think this is just another bailout for Chicago, where we're taking money from downstate and giving it to ourselves to prop ourselves up. But that's not it at all. Chicago generates so much wealth for the state, and if we let that slip, the financial health of the entire state gets worse. For every dollar we invest in transit, we get $13 back in return. We just can't let this moment pass. I'm partnering with Better Streets Chicago to make this video, and they have a lot of excellent calls to action to help you get involved. Go to their website, which will be linked in the description, and sign their pledge to help save transit. Call your elected officials, not just once, but several times this week. Call the governor's office and demand that he call a special session this summer to fix this. Keep up to date on what Better Streets Chicago is doing to help save transit, and get involved with them and fight with them. This isn't over. We can still fix this, but we have to step up. They're not going to act unless we do. So let's get out there and get involved.